When you start to think about writing your book, often it can feel really daunting. We don't know where we're headed, we don't know the steps along the way. But one thing that can be really reassuring for first time authors is having a sense of how long that book needs to be. And that's why one of the most common questions that I hear from folks I'm working with is, how long should my book be? And I do think this is a really helpful question. So I want to talk through some of the considerations, some of the questions to ask yourself, and of course, some of the normative word count lengths in this video. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. When you start to write your book, one of the most common pieces of advice I find myself giving out is that you need to have a plan. But I also realize that when you're just starting out, there are so many unknown factors that it's really difficult to make a plan in the first place. So that's why we offer the Memoir Method Checklist. You can download that at pageandpodium.com/checklist, as well as our calculator, which you can download at pageandpodium.com/calculator. Both of these tools are really helpful. But both of them are going to be even more helpful to you if you have some sense of how long this project is going to wind up being. It's just going to allow you to subdivide out, plan, break down smaller chunks of the process. Once you have the tools and the word count, you'll be in much better shape than when you're just starting out and not sure where you're headed. But it's also really difficult when you're not inside the book industry to know how long your book should be. So today I want to start out by talking about some of the normative lengths that we see in the industry, as well as some of the normative lengths that I have seen work really well for first-time authors. Then I want to give you some questions to ask yourself, because I don't think you should just stop at the normative number. I think you need to make sure that you are tailoring that number to your project, your goals, and your readers. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up by offering some considerations, just things to keep in mind as you are working through that set of questions, as you are thinking about how your book might compare to normative book lengths, all that. Okay, so let's get started just by talking about some of the normative book lengths that we see in the industry. And I'm particularly here talking about normative lengths for first-time writers. One clarification that I do want to make: when you are a very experienced author, if you have many, many books under your belt, or if you are a celebrity that's writing a memoir, these rules are going to be pretty separate, right? We see books that are celebrity memoirs or celebrity biographies that are very, very, very long, and we also will see books from kind of business celebrities that are very, very short. So when we're thinking about this, I want to really tailor this to our first-time authors, since I know that's what most of you are. So first of all, memoir, that is my specialty. So with first-time memoir authors, we always suggest think about in the range of 60,000 words. Now, I've gone into a lot of detail in how to structure, how to outline your memoir, how to make progress on it. So you can go back through the other videos, podcast episodes, or blog posts if you're interested in some of that. But suffice it to say, if you start with a 60,000 word count goal, that allows you to really easily apply our quadrant system that we teach in the memoir method. If you have 60,000 words, you usually will end up with about 20 chapters, 3,000 words per chapter. That works out to about 10 pages, and that ends up being really bite-sized chunks, really nice length quadrants. It's just really helpful for first-time authors to start with that 60K word count for memoir. Now, if you are writing a business book, things are a little bit different, right? Our reader is really different. The expectations are really different. So I will often recommend for first-time business book authors that you go quite a bit shorter than that. that. I find that 45,000 is a really good length if you're pretty established, a fairly established business leader. But really, a 30,000 word count book can be ideal for that first book to really get your name out there, get your expertise out there, start a speaking career, whatever it is you're looking to do. So business owners, you can think a little bit on the shorter side, 30K to 45K. Really longer than that starts to actually be less appealing to your particular reader. So we'll go a little shorter than we would for memoir. I also work with a lot of self-help authors, people who are working on personal development, things like addiction recovery or fitness, nutrition, that sort of thing. If you are doing one of those books, self-help is unfortunately one of the broadest word count genres. We will see these all the way from that 30K word count that business books can be, all the way through to over 100,000 words. So unfortunately, I do not have as concise of advice for you if you are self-help, but I would think about, as a first-time author, that 60K word count is a really good target. And really for self-help, there is probably no reason you need to go much, much longer than that. Usually I find with first-time self-help authors, that 45K, that works really well. So don't feel like you have to make it so long. Oftentimes, when you are a little bit more concise and keep things a little tighter, you'll come across as more of an expert anyway. So for self-help, that's really what we're looking for. So you can think a little bit shorter, but you have more leeway if you want to go longer than that. And finally, as you probably know, I really only work with nonfiction authors, but I did want to just toss in here for the novelists out there. Novels are much longer than that. A proper novel is usually going to be 100, 120K and up. So that is not something that is in my expertise, but it is something that might be helpful for you as you're kind of thinking about, either as a fiction writer, how long you want your book to be, or if you are a nonfiction writer who reads fiction books, it's sometimes really helpful to know that the expectations for fiction are much longer. You're really not trying to match page count or word count to those fiction books that I know that we all love to read. Okay, so now having gotten out of the way some of these normative ranges, I really want to talk about how you can tailor your word count expectations to your project. Really everything in writing your book. It's so tempting to come over to what is the industry doing? What's everybody else doing? But oftentimes, the best way to make your book really strong and really make it stand out from the crowd is to think about some of the considerations that originally went into setting these norms. In other words, when we were just starting out that fledgling book industry, there were no norms, right? These norms were developed through a process of thinking about the books, the authors, the publishers, and the audience. So that's what I want to kind of take you through, is thinking about those kinds of considerations. So I've got some questions to ask you before I add some caveats at the end. Okay, the first question I want you to ask is, how does your audience read? Now, with all considerations in your first book project and your second and third and fourth, the main consideration you want to make is for your reader. The reader is the most important entity out there, hands down. So I want you to start by thinking about who is your audience and how do they like to read. So for memoir readers, if we imagine someone reading kind of a typical inspirational memoir, that's usually what we work with in the memoir method, oftentimes we're going to think about someone who wants a really kind of cozy, indulgent experience, right? And that tends to be why that word count is a little bit longer than what we would recommend for a business book. Business book readers, of course, tend to be business owners, aspiring business owners, folks that are in this kind of entrepreneurial world. Well, of course, people are not reading those books to kind of savor and enjoy the language, right? Oftentimes, business book readers want a much quicker, more efficient read. Hence the shorter word count, right? Those are folks who are wanting to kind of get through chapters pretty quickly. Oftentimes it's folks who either in the morning or right before bed at the end of the workday have kind of a habit of reading a couple of chapters of a book. So that's really who we're trying to target then with business books. When you think about those two genres, for instance, you can really see how the difference in the word count is tailored to the type of reader that we're looking for. That's true if you're doing self-help, that's true if you're doing fiction, that is true for any genre of writing. So, before you decide on your word count, I want you to really think about who is your reader? What do they like to do? What types of reading experiences do they enjoy? How quickly do they want to get finished with that book? How much are they wanting to kind of curl up with the book versus reading it quickly at their desk? Think about who that reader is, and then you can kind of adjust those normative word counts up or down depending on who you're trying to target. Okay, the second question that I want you to ask yourself is, how do you want to publish? Unfortunately, if you are wanting to publish traditionally, there is much, much more pressure for you to fall into the normative word count lengths than, say, if you're going to self-publish. So if you are wanting to traditionally publish, it is very, very much worth thinking about the normative word count. Now, the word counts that I gave at the beginning of this video, memoir at 60K for instance, I would not go lower than that by much if you're wanting to publish traditionally. In fact, you can go a bit higher, but if you're wanting to publish traditionally with memoir, you really want to stick between, say, 60 and probably about 80 or 90K, just because on one hand, we really want to know that you had enough to kind of develop out some of the reflections, all those juicy details that memoir readers love. But if you send a 200K word memoir to an agent, it's probably going in the garbage just because nobody wants to read kind of a long-winded autobiography, right? So sticking in that 60 to 100 if you're wanting to publish traditionally and you're writing a memoir. Business books, same thing. I'd stick to 45 to 60. But with business books, I also find that many people are very wisely wanting to self-publish. For business owners, oftentimes the revenue that you're generating from that book is not book sales. It is rather either paid speaking keynote engagements or bringing in more clients into your business by demonstrating your expertise. You wrote the book on the subject, right? So in that case, if you're wanting to self-publish, you really don't need as much of those guidelines as you do if you want to traditionally publish. So if you are somebody that's wanting a traditional book deal, stick in kind of those guidelines that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And it's also worth picking up what we call some comps. Those are comparative or competing titles, depending on how you want to define that term. And all you're looking for are books that are similar in topic, similar in voice or style, and similar in audience. So if you can kind of pick out who is your kind of dreamiest publisher, look at the types of books that they are publishing that are similar to yours within the last just couple of years, and that'll give you some sense of kind of how hefty that book is. It's hard to know word count, of course, from a published book, but you can get some kind of sense if it's longer or shorter, and then you can try to kind of hit into that window. If you're self-publishing, throw that all out the window. All we're going to think about is your readers if you're self-publishing. Okay, so beyond thinking about how your reader reads, where you want to publish, how you want to publish, the third question that I want you to ask yourself is, how much depth does your genre and topic demand? Now, this is going to be totally something that you're going to have to think about, ponder, figure out. I cannot give you a rule of thumb here, but I do want to give you an example. So we mentioned earlier thinking about business books being a little bit shorter. But business books are not business books. There is a huge range of business books that are out there, right? And if we think about a book that is designed for new business owners, people who are struggling to get their first business up and running, oftentimes the depth needs to be a little bit shallower, right? We need to be a little bit more efficient, a little bit more concise. And that is not, by the way, because you're not going to be able, or you wouldn't be able to write more. It's rather because we're thinking about the topic and what it demands of us. On the other hand, when we're thinking about memoir or fiction, these storytelling genres, that genre is going to demand of us that we're putting much more of these kind of visceral details. We want the audience to feel like they're there. They can see, smell, hear, touch, all of those things that the characters, whether that's you or fictional characters, are experiencing in the world of that story. Of course, when we start putting those visceral storytelling details in there, we need more space. Just It demands it, right? So as you're thinking about what is your genre and what is your topic, I really want you to push against that part of you that has a particular word count in mind as being right or wrong. And I really want you to think about, what are you trying to say? Who are you trying to say it to? And what considerations do you need to make in terms of topic and genre and your word count? What does that topic and genre demand, and how can you meet that demand by tailoring your word count to your project? Okay. And the fourth consideration, the fourth question that I want you to ask yourself is, do you tend to be long-winded, or do you tend to be more concise? You may not know this about yourself if you have not done a lot of writing prior to working on your book, but oftentimes I find that people do have a sense. Are you a person, when you send an email, who writes a couple sentences and calls it good? Or are you someone like me who writes paragraphs and then has to go back through and delete some because this is getting out of hand? If you are the first type of writer, it only makes sense to set a shorter word count goal for yourself. Otherwise, you're probably just going to end up frustrating yourself. So if you're more concise, just plan on being at that lower range of your genre's word count target. On the other hand, if you are very long-winded, you're going to want to kind of watch out for that, right? We don't want a whole bunch of padding and extra diatribes in there. But also, if you know you're long-winded, you will not have the same trouble hitting a little bit higher word count goal as someone who is just naturally much more concise. So when you are thinking about your project, it is okay to think about your writing style in addition to these other questions. Totally okay to lean in whatever comes naturally to you, whether that's more concise or more long-winded. Okay, as you are working through those questions, there are a couple of just general tips I want to give you, things that I see first-time authors kind of struggle with or stumble over, or misconceptions that I hear a lot, just because these are going to help you feel a lot more confident as you are answering those questions and as you are determining what that word count should be. Okay, so the first of those considerations is that I want you to remember that your word count goal is just a guideline when you get started. Now, not everyone's going to struggle with this, but if you are someone who tends to be very black and white, who tends to, if you set a goal, you are going to hit that goal regardless of whether it remains relevant by the time you get there. I'm like that, by the way. It's really useful to remember that when you set that word count goal, it is just a general guideline. It is just meant to be something that you can plug into that calculator so that you get a sense of how long the book's going to take. It is just meant to guide you. So as you are writing, it is possible that, for instance, you're writing your memoir, you're aiming for 60K words, 3K per chapter, and 20 chapters. Well, maybe that first chapter is only 2,000 words. Maybe the second one is 3,500. Maybe the third one is 1,500. We'll probably need to flesh that out a little bit. But as you are going through, I want you to remember to give yourself some flexibility and some kindness. None of us, even professional writers, can predict how long exactly a book will be. I'm pretty good. Having done this for a long time, I'm pretty good at figuring out how to make sure I hit that word count. But even then, I will sometimes be wrong about it. So if you are a first-time author, you're going to have to do some trial and error, some experimentation to really figure out what works for you. So remember that that word count goal is really just a guideline. It's really meant to help you keep yourself on track. It is not meant to be a punishment. Okay, the second thing I want you to keep in mind is that you can differ from the norms. Now, obviously, if you are going for that traditional book deal, as I said earlier, you will need to stick a little closer to what we would consider normative within your genre. But at the same time, there are always exceptions to the rules, right? So if you have a really compelling reason that your book needs to be shorter or longer, I think you should go for it. It is okay to break those norms. Of course, you've got to balance this with your expectations. How important is it to you that you get that book deal? You may need to kind of adjust a little bit, but particularly if you are open to publishing through alternative routes, either self or a hybrid publisher, it might be that something that's a little different from the norm is actually a much, much better way to serve your book. If that's the case, go for it. Don't let anybody tell you that a norm is some kind of a rule that no one ever breaks. It isn't true, and it may be that your project is one that has a very good justification for breaking those norms. Okay, the third consideration I want you to keep in mind is that your first draft very well may not hit that word count. You may go over if you're long-winded, you may go under if you're more concise. That's all right. Every book must be revised. Every book. And when we get into the revising, that is often the place where either, if you're a long-winded person, you'll kind of start to see that there are some redundancies, there are some really wordy sentences, there are probably stuff that can just be cut, right? At the same time, if you are a more concise person, what I very often find with memoir particularly is that our scenes are so concise that people have a lot of questions. So oftentimes you finish your draft, you get a little bit of feedback, and that feedback just ends up being kind of questions. Oh, what happened here? What was this like? Where were you? Once you start answering those questions, your word count's going to go way up, right? So when you finish that first draft, and even as you're working on it, just really keep in mind that it is totally possible that you will change your word count fairly significantly in the revision process. It is not unusual for your word count to change 20%, 25, 30%, depending on kind of how your writing style works as you're going through your revision stages. So that word count, especially for your first draft, again, it is really just a guideline. Things are very likely to change as you revise. Okay, the fourth consideration, I want you to remember that publishers care way more about word count than readers. Again, when we're talking about publishing traditionally versus self, we got to keep that in mind at all times. But the most important thing is that your reader enjoys your book. So, as you are thinking through, as you are looking at those comps titles, the titles that are similar to yours, it's okay to say, well, you know what, this was fine for such and such author, but I don't think my reader is like that. I think my reader wants it to be shorter. I think my reader wants it to be longer. That's an okay consideration because it is your reader who matters the very, very most. So as you are thinking through these guidelines, as I know you are Googling around to different sources, you will see and hear that people will sometimes be very definitive about the correct word count. That is very often from the perspective of the publishing industry. Often readers don't agree with that. So if you are in a particular circumstance where the audience that you're writing for is likely to differ from maybe what we might normally think of for that genre, the reader is going to be much more appreciative of you tailoring things to them than they are about you tailoring things to some kind of publishing entity that actually most readers don't think about at all. And the final consideration that I want you to keep in the back of your mind, arguably the most important, your word count does not mean anything about you. It is so easy to tell ourselves that our book is either too short because we're not good enough writers, too long because we just ramble and ramble and ramble. None of that is true, okay? Anytime we're doing a project, there are different kinds of considerations. It doesn't mean anything about you, how long or short your book is. So, oftentimes I will hear this come up in the form of, well, you know, I don't want my book to just be like a pamphlet. Or people will say like, well, you know, I have this book next to me and it's like, it's real hefty. And I want when people pick up my book, I want it to be really hefty like that. This is fine. It's great to have your kind of own goals, your own perspective, your own way of thinking about things. And I totally get it. I just want to make sure that we are never using something like word count, a relatively arbitrary quantitative measure, to mean something about ourselves. It doesn't. It doesn't. Some of the best experts in the world, some of the most renowned, respected authors publish pretty short books. not because they can't write a longer one, but because they made the conscious decision to stick on the shorter side. So be really careful that you are not letting your brain tell you that a shorter book is not as valuable. It's not the case at all. We have all read books that were really, really long and we wondered why they were so long. And we have all read short books that packed such a punch that we were so grateful for the content and the opportunity for us to think even more deeply on the concisely worded subjects. Okay, as you're thinking about your word count, I know that this can be really stressful and really confusing. So just remember that you can stick with the norms, ask yourself some of these questions to tailor those norms to your project, and keep in mind, be flexible with yourself. Be kind to yourself. Okay, as you are setting out, continuing these writing goals for 2025, please let me know if there's anything I can do to help you. We will be opening the doors for the memoir method next month. So if you are somebody who has been on the fence, been thinking about applying, head over and apply right now. pageandpodium.com/apply. We would love to see you in our April cohort. Okay, happy word count, happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.